We can move on. You need to understand the difference between a relative and absolute cell reference. There are two types of cell references in Excel, absolute and relative. When you are creating, copying, or moving formulas, you need to know which type of cell reference to use. The results of your function or formula will vary depending on the type of reference you use. On the screen, you see an example of a function and a formula. Both have examples of a relative and absolute cell reference. Let's look at the function. In the function example, we see an average function equals average C3, E4, E6. Find the average of the contents in cells C3, E4, and E6. But notice that there is something special about the reference C3. C3 has dollar signs in front of the column and row names. These dollar signs signify an absolute cell reference. Same in the formula. Here's the dollar signs. This is an absolute cell reference. When you don't see the dollar signs, these are relative cell references. Relative, absolute. But what do these terms mean? Okay, so let's talk about the relative cell references. When you copy a formula from one cell into another cell, what happens is Excel will look at the formula and determine if the references are relative or absolute. For relative cell references, Excel will look for cells that are in a similar position or pattern as the original cell formula. So if you copy a function from one column and paste it into another, let's say you copy sum A11 through A14, and you took that function and you copied it into column B. Sum A11, A14 then becomes sum B11, B14. It follows a pattern and is relative to the original position. For absolute values, when you copy a formula or function into another cell, those cell references will not change at all. So, if you copy a function from one column to another, sum absolute A11 and absolute A16 will remain sum absolute 11 and absolute A16. How can you recognize a relative and absolute value? Well, C3 is relative because there are no dollar signs. This C3 is absolute because of the dollar signs. Notice that the dollar signs are in front of the column and the row. Now you can have mixed cell references, which means one of the values are absolute and the other is relative. So here we have an absolute column C and a relative row 3. Don't worry, we're not going to cover mixed cell references here. Okay, now that we have looked at the concepts behind relative and absolute values, let's see it in practice. If you have the intermediate Excel spreadsheet, go ahead and click on the Relative Absolute Values tab at the bottom. So here we have a worksheet with the price of candy. You'll notice that the standard price for a piece of candy is $1.50, and if a discount is applied, it's going to be 10%. In column A, we have the amount of candy ordered. Column B, we have the total price of the candies. And then column C, we have the total price with the discount applied. If I click into into cell B5, I can see a formula. The formula is finding the total price of the candy, so it's taking the amount of candy times the price of candy. In the formula bar, you'll notice that the amount of candy is a relative value. There are no dollar signs. It's just A5. And the price of candy is an absolute value. It's $1.50. That's because the price per piece of candy does not change. It will always be this $1.50 amount. And $1.50 is located in F2. So every time we want to find the total of the price of candy, we have to times the amount of candy to this price. It always has to point to this cell with this value. In cell B6, again we see a relative value, A6, and F2, because it's an absolute value with the dollar signs, has not changed. It's still F2. If I click down, we see that the relative value has changed to A7, and the absolute value has remained the same, F2. Notice that the relative value changes based off the position of the current cell that I have active. So here the relative value is A9. That's because it is referencing this cell right here with the amount of 5 candy times this absolute value of $1.50. So I'm going to go to the very bottom and I'm going to use autofill by clicking and dragging to complete this pattern. Notice that the relative value will change based off the position. So we have A16, A17, but that absolute value F2 stays the same. This way the total price and the total price category is always accurate. So what pattern is it following? Well, the original formula, the relative value was one cell to the left. So in the next formula, it will still be one cell to the left, so forth and so on. In the total of discount column, we have B5 minus B5 times F3. F3 is the new absolute value, so it's always going to reference that 10% discount, regardless of the cell that I click on. Now, Excel follows the order of operations, which is why we can write out B8 minus B8 times F3. It knows to do the multiplication first, and then do the subtraction. So here we have at the bottom B14 minus B14 times the F3. If I do an autofill, again, the amount will remain accurate because these two values are relative. So it will look for the pattern. Well, it's always going to reference the cell to the left. So that relative value changes to the cell to the left. The absolute value, F3, no matter which cell I click into or which cell I copy the formula into, will always be right here, F3. That's because the 10% value doesn't change.